In the Darkness I See by Anon Y. Chapter 1. A Lifetime of Questions. Part 2. Though my father had successfully established a micro-immortalization and named it me, his blood down the line, he was eventually abolished from the physical plane. Into some energetic realm he journeyed. Life, like a river, had finished flowing through him. All that remained was the memory of him, and his lugubrious lessons. Like some muddied alluvium, thick with begrudged sediment and ready for transformation, his bellicose ideas violently stuck with me. Though the need for structure and direction was espoused by many of my intellectual leaders, and I had taught all their parallel sentiments to my father, he had never attained a sense of robust purpose in one or a plethora of goals. That evasion of his thoughtful struggle with life was always a substantial distraction from the impending, rather than a solution to it. It was with much study and problematic resolution that I discovered that the verisimilitude of his productive life was as shallow as the anti-religious bedrock from which it had ungallantly grown. In the hearts of so many like my father, far too stained to ever accept true wisdom, dopaminergic focus brought little joy. In the mists of the information age, though, the refusal of religiosity became irrevocable. Lost in a sea of small achievements and status, they were all deprived of the wholesome warmth that their ancestors had inherited. Once the strangulated truths of the corrupted transcendental had been uncovered as unholy, there was no return to glory. The drive for knowledge that had led men through incredible strife turned inwards and emptied itself. My father along for the ride. Only moral destitution remained. The monstrously unstable life of the men who enthralled themselves with the hedonic pleasures of the fine world was purposeless and thus unfulfilling. The bearings of such fellows were never linear, consistently unsteady. My father's short-sighted pursuit of gratification and meager long-term accomplishments proved to be as shallow as his kindness. His faulty substructure failed him. It failed us. Always having an interest in the endocrinological truths of humanity, but never caring enough to classify them as such, my father would ground many of his arguments in the hormonal profiling of men and women. That approach, intertwined with the moral centrism that his pained heart had refined, was always rather satisfying for the wounded audience he gathered. There was always a reason to pull up your bootstraps and get back to work, but never one for pursuing the enrapturement of true purpose, sovereign greatness. He was far too arrogantly scientific to identify himself from the lost crowd. The main problem with my father's insistence on biology was that it was an unaired and accidental deferment to nihilism. Without a system of molecules indicating emotions, one's life, according to my father, was absolutely random. He was so close to the truth of consciousness, the truth of its divine creation through specification, peeking in between some of his syllables. He remained unresolved in his purpose throughout his life, espousing the stagnantly supposed truths that he could never justify in his own heart, but continued jamming into others' minds. There were many nights where I watched him in the dark, those truths gnawing at him. The communist mentality had truly stolen his whole. Scientific assertions always devalued his life. I watched on as the gradual degradation of all he wanted to be true took a hold of him. The virtues he thought clung strongly to life faded in the presence of secular pragmatism, his unfurled self. It was a means to an end, a circular war of intellect that answered one proposition and wedged open another. As it was, too, with all his posthumous pals, my father found his faith in the final weeks of his life. Between violent seizures, my father would write. His new understanding, abridged, was that life was about facing suffering head-on. His moribund predictability truly stifled the last of my hopes. Using previously detested endocrinological truths, he discovered the subjectivity of our self-serving thoughts, and his nightly visions proved them to be senseless. Borrowing from Nietzsche, he began his structured and regimented derivation of meaning at the end of his life. By that time, the alcohol had taken a hold of much of his mind, disallowing coherent speech. However unspeakable my father's psychological consequences became, he managed to write. He wrote out many scrambled pages of revelations. Though mostly made up of derivative ramblings, a paragraph from the latter half of his final words interested me greatly. While he slept, a couple days before his last breath, I found him grasping at a single note. I discovered the document he prized most. Within it, there was one resounding proof of his existence. The message sang true. The following words echoed in my mind for months. Meaning and painful daily action will inevitably lead to a more rooted and significant existence. The search for meaning is deeply ingrained in struggle. From the Russian peasants of the 17th century in the uprising of Bolotnikov to the early 20th century Marxist revolutionaries against the Tsarist war front of imprisonment in the October Revolution, we have remained in movement. After the latter false victory crushed most of its own, the silent fight against tyranny began. The survivors were not so inclined to be annihilated under the filthy boots of the oppressive bluecaps. Change has been the only real constant in the motherland, in thought and in life. This fluctuating moral landscape has birthed the greatest scholars in Russia. Floating morality and self-defined purpose have carried through all the works of Russia. The extrapolations and interpretations of their works are not only included into the Western ethos, they are ingrained within it. Misguided or virtuous as movements may be, the struggle for change fuels us. Decadence gifts time, but time births resentment. Hope is our most valued commodity. Hope is faith. Faith is God. God guides us to unity. My father's lengthy death, so graciously gifted by liver failure, allowed for a lengthy period of intense introspection and deliberation. The rapid removal of life, in the case of an accidental suicide, would have left us remaining people with a sense of longing and sadness. In that case, only that subset of grief would have been fixated upon by his already melancholy inner circle. While that emotional turmoil, in its own narrow context, would have been profound and lofty, it would have subsisted on a few elementary fragments. The simple break in hormonal connection is the main driver of my sudden disappearance's sadness, he surely would have said. At the time of his death, it was clear to me how I felt. Through my years of medical study and rolled over, educated self-introspection, my sense of connection and longing for my father, bridged and strengthened by the repeated excretion and physiological saturation of my very own anti-separative hormones, had been inextricably obfuscated and then totally hollowed. While the oxytocin, progesterone, and prolactin may have flowed in high enough concentrations within my mother for her to have justified my father's abhorrent behavior, the faint love bubble bath of chemicals that meagerly pulsated through my poor vasculature proved infinitesimal when contrasted with my panic hurts, adrenaline spikes, and my sadness's stifling serotonergic stagnation. Starkly insufficient. My emotional state, neither distraught nor destitute, was my mother's largest worry at my father's funeral, where I had refused to pretend by pomp to marvel over how flawlessly he had fathered me. My miserable matriarch eventually cornered me and demanded of me a full-force apologia. I laughed at her falsity, reached into my jacket, and pulled out another of my father's lost writings. From my torn and tattered piece of paper, I read off the following little apprentice piece. The gatherings of shared personal memories is another meaty portion of the scarred aftermath of death. This tranche, of course, has been elaborated on in numerous pieces of art, the most valuable of which being the most memorable. The final parcel of a death is the reminder of one's own mortality, from one for many. My long death is short-lived. My time has come. My mother did not enjoy my truth. She scrambled off to a cluster of cloaked widows and sour sisters, leaving me to simmer. As I sat stupefied by my reality, I thought for a while about the actual paths that my father's death and my prolonged mourning had taken. His death had not been a surprise, nor an expeditious process. The old man's withdrawal from humanity had in fact taken months to complete. Those months, filled with my mother's tears and my own perplexing admiration for a man about which I knew very little, had taken my mind. In that same time, I had repetitively and furiously written and discovered many things about the human condition, but the similarities between my work and his drove me to curse his name. My father's time on earth had indeed been difficult, the depth of his elongated suffering and the rawness of his girthy dismantling indisputable. And so, after ruminating on my own reminiscing, I added to my father's little note, writing the following on the back of now our piece of paper. Your life was enormous. Your animation was a voracious memoir to pain, opus to suffering, and compendium of wraths. In life, you were insignificant yet powerful. In death, though, your work was partially admirable. The purport of that specific phenomenon continues to dumbfound me well after your passing. You have given us nothing special. No commodious or festivity-filled moment for me or our loved ones. I thought something, anything, was going to happen in our last moments, unplanned and raw. It would have been marvelous. By way of spiritual terminal turbulence, I begged the universe that I would be presented with some soothing sentiment onto which I could hold. One thing to prove that I loved you, that I love you, and you me. You have left us only with the loose shreds of a bland philosophy, and me with your curse of pontification. Your void departure has shattered the very bedrock from which I have constructed my potential meaning. Already fragile from being unceremoniously shaken by your ailed parenthood, I have obviously taken your jarringly empty death especially hard. Why have you done this to me? I reread my notes from within my pew as the preacher preached unknowing send-offs to my father's blue milieu. The words of the multi-rethought note eventually lost meaning, and my mind wandered into the real truth. I eventually arrived at a reasonable closure on exactly how we had strayed so far from one another. I simply believed that our distance was generated solely by my father's adherence to a tainted, principled value system, wrong, inflexible, and unforgiving. He and I had clashed mostly in the ideological realm, and so I knew with all of the worst in me that I was in the right. The anecdotal manifestations of our adversative value systems had always followed the same path. I had just wanted approval, safety in what I thought to be true and who I was, disguised sloppily. And he always wanted the most direct solution truth. Always following my revealing stories was my antagonizing father's ploy to compel me under his narrow moral compass. It had been a simple yet enormously adversarial dichotomy, inescapable for us always. This has been Chapter 1, Part 2 of In the Darkness I See by Anon Y.